There's a notion out there, a pretty loud one, that tells you a leader's got to be the loudest voice in the room, the one with the biggest title tacked to his door. It tells you power wears a suit and tie, carries a clipboard, and barks orders from on high. And for a long time, most of us just nod along, because that's the way we've always seen it, the way the world seems to spin. We look up, we look around, and we figure the folks at the top are the ones calling the shots, setting the pace, making everything happen. But life, she's got a funny way of showing you that sometimes the folks who actually make the wheels turn, the ones who truly move something heavy, ain't the ones you see on the evening news. Sometimes they're just the hands, the quiet ones, the ones who show up every single day and get to work, leaving more than just sweat on the floor. Sometimes true strength, the kind that changes things, comes from places you'd never expect. Wyatt was one of those hands. 47 years old, a factory man through and through. He'd spent the better part of 3 decades wrestling steel into submission on the assembly line at the old Midwest fabricators plant. The place smelled of hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, sweet decay of time eating away at worn machinery. It was a scent that had seeped into his skin, his clothes, even the fibers of his worn work boots. He wasn't a big man, not in the way a bulldozer is big, but he carried a quiet, undeniable strength. You saw it in the set of his jaw, in the way his shoulders, broad and solid, always seemed ready to bear a load, whether it was a heavy part or a silent burden. His hair, once a sandy brown, was now a salt and pepper blend, kept neatly trimmed, always just above his collar. Lines deep and honest, fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched there by years of squinting under fluorescent lights, but also, you suspected, by countless moments of silent observation, of watching the world turn without needing to say a word. His hands, though, those were the storytellers. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin permanently stained with grease and tiny flecks of metal that had defied every scrub brush. Calluses as tough as old leather formed a second skin on his palms, a testament to the thousands of bolts tightened, the countless pieces lifted, the unending rhythm of the production line. They were the hands of a man who understood the language of tools, of torque, of honest labor. When he gripped a wrench, it became an extension of himself, precise and powerful. He didn't gesticulate much when he spoke, which was rare enough anyway, but those hands resting on his thighs or wrapped around a coffee mug conveyed a steady, dependable presence. They didn't seek attention, those hands. They just worked patiently, meticulously day in and day out. Wyatt kept to himself mostly, not out of coldness, but out of a habit born of routine and a certain respect for personal space, both his own and others. He wasn't one for the locker room banter that often turned coarse or shallow. He'd listen, nodding occasionally, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his tired eyes signaling understanding or a touch of empathy. His uniform, the standard issue blue coveralls, was always clean, pressed even, a small detail that spoke volumes about the man. He was reliable, that was the word most people would use. Wyatt, you could count on him. He'd show up, he'd do his job. And if you needed a hand, a quiet word of advice on a tricky weld, he'd offer it without fuss or expectation of thanks. He was a steady hand, yes, a rock in the often turbulent flow of factory life, but never a front-runner. The idea of leading, of stepping out in front, simply wasn't something that ever entered Wyatt's mind. He was a cog, a vital one, but just a cog in a vast, grinding machine. He figured that was his lot, and he carried it with quiet dignity. The glow from the old digital clock was always the first thing Wyatt saw. 4:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the alarm, a habit etched into his bones after nearly 30 years of factory life. He'd swing his feet to the cool linoleum, the familiar ache in his lower back a morning greeting. Sarah, his wife, would stir beside him, murmuring something he never quite caught before settling back into sleep. He'd make coffee, strong and black, the clatter of the mug against the counter the loudest sound in the quiet house. By 5:30, he was in his worn pickup, the engine turning over with a familiar groan, joining the procession of identical trucks heading towards the looming silhouette of the industrial park. The sky would be a bruised purple, slowly lightening to a hazy gray, mirroring the landscape of his mind. The factory parking lot was already filling up, a testament to the relentless early morning churn of this world. He'd walk through the gate, past the guard who barely glanced up, and into the cavernous main floor, where the scent of hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and stale coffee was as familiar as his own skin. His station was in Assembly Line C, Unit 7. He knew every bolt, every weld, every rhythmic hiss and clank of the machinery. For 8, sometimes 10 hours a day, his hands moved with an almost subconscious grace, assembling the intricate parts of heavy machinery. Repetition was the king here, and Wyatt was its most loyal subject. The rhythmic grind of the presses, the whine of the conveyor belts, the occasional shout drowned out by ear protection. It was the soundtrack of his existence, a constant drone that settled deep into his bones. He knew the job, knew it cold, could do it with his eyes closed, and sometimes it felt like he did. The money, steady as it was, always seemed to stretch thinner than it ought to. There were the house payments, the rising cost of groceries, the endless stream of utility bills that appeared on the kitchen counter like silent, demanding sentinels. He and Sarah didn't complain much, not out loud. They just tightened their belts a little more, forwent that new paint for the living room, opted for the older car for another year. They'd worked hard their whole lives, scraped by, raised 2 good kids who'd flown the coop and were doing all right for themselves. That was the comfort, the quiet pride they held on to, but the constant struggle, the feeling of always running just to stay in place, weighed on him, a dull ache deeper than any in his back. But beneath the steady surface, under the skin of the reliable factory man, there was a quiet current that sometimes stirred. Wyatt carried a past self, a younger man with different fires in his belly. He remembered the eager apprentice he once was, full of questions and ideas, convinced he could tweak the processes, make things run smoother, build a better mousetrap. He'd even drafted a few sketches in those days, improvements to existing designs, tucked away now in a dusty box in the garage, forgotten. Those sparks, those early ambitions had slowly been smothered by the relentless pragmatic realities of the factory floor, by the unwritten rule that you did your job and you didn't rock the boat. He saw himself as a cog, and in that he found a certain peace, a definition. Leadership, he'd always thought, belonged to the men in the offices, the ones with the ties and the titles, the ones who gave the orders. He often saw the potential in others, especially the younger ones, the quick minds, the ones still full of that initial fire. He'd watch them quietly, picking up on their frustrations, their small victories. He could see their strengths, their unique ways of looking at a problem, long before they could see it themselves. But he always held back, convinced his voice wasn't the one that mattered, that his insights were just observations from the sidelines. What good would his words do, he'd think? He was just another hands-on man, not a speechmaker, not an inspirer. A quiet hope for better conditions for his peers often flickered, a wish that things could be easier, more supportive, but it was always accompanied by a hidden doubt, a whisper that his own influence was too small, too insignificant to make any real difference. This self-effacing nature, this deep-seated belief that true leadership was for others, was his silent companion, his constant limiting shadow. That shadow, for years, had been a comfortable, if somewhat dim, place to reside. It gave him an excuse not to step forward, not to risk, not to potentially fail. He'd told himself it was humility, pragmatism. But then the shadow began to crack. It started subtly, as these things often do. A young apprentice, fresh out of the vocational school, had started on the line. Name was Leo, 20 years old maybe, with a bright, eager set to his jaw and eyes that still held the shine of new ambition. He was quick, sharper than most, always asking why rather than just how. Wyatt watched him quietly from his own station, admiring the boy's natural curiosity. The way he'd tackle a complex assembly with a careful intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. Leo reminded Wyatt of himself, years ago, before the edges had worn smooth, before the constant hum of the machinery had dulled the sharp edges of his own youthful hope. The factory, though, wasn't built for questions, it was built for repetition, for process, for fitting into the mold. The supervisors, good men in their own way, were products of that same system, their job to keep the gears turning, not to encourage individual expression. Wyatt saw the small slights, the impatient sighs when Leo tried a slightly different, more efficient way to fasten a plate. He heard the brusque corrections, the insistence on the way we've always done it, even when Leo's method was clearly better. He watched Leo's shoulders, initially squared with pride, begin to sag. The questions faded. The eagerness in his eyes slowly gave way to a weary acceptance, then a quiet frustration. One sweltering afternoon, the air thick with the smell of metal dust and stale oil, Wyatt saw Leo at his bench, hunched over a component. He wasn't working, he was just staring. his tools scattered around him like fallen soldiers. His hands, usually deft and precise, were hanging limp. Wyatt walked over, pretending to check a nearby machine. He heard Leo mutter almost to himself, a raw, defeated whisper. "What's the point? Just what's the point?" Wyatt froze. That wasn't just a bad day talking. That was the sound of a spirit dimming, of a flame being snuffed out, slowly, methodically, by the very place that was supposed to teach and develop it. He saw the fire in Leo's eyes, the fire Wyatt had seen in himself and countless others over the years, flicker dangerously low. He watched Leo slowly begin to pack his toolbox, not for the end of the shift, but with a deliberate, final air. The young man's movements were slow, heavy. He was quitting, not just the job, but perhaps in some fundamental way, he was quitting on that part of himself, that spark of innovation, that belief in his own power to improve, to question, to create. Wyatt felt a sharp, unexpected pain in his own chest, a cold knot tightening in his gut. It was as if he was watching a younger version of himself, years ago, making the same quiet surrender. The bosses, oblivious, walked past, barking orders, pushing for output. They saw a worker, perhaps a difficult one, certainly one who wasn't fast enough, but they didn't see Leo. They didn't see the man. And Wyatt, for all his quiet observations, had seen it, felt it, but had done nothing. His silence, he realized with a sickening jolt, made him complicit. The next few hours passed in a blur of clanking machinery and the rhythmic thud of presses. Wyatt finished his shift, the metallic taste of the factory floor now mixed with a bitter residue of regret. He drove home, the familiar route passing through the working-class streets, the modest houses, each holding its own silent struggles. Sarah greeted him with a soft smile. Dinner already on the table, but he could only pick at his food, his mind elsewhere, replaying the image of Leo's defeated slump, the glint of frustration in his young eyes. He went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The digital clock on his bedside table glowed a cold, indifferent red, 1:37 a.m., then 2:15, finally 300, 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when the factory floor seemed to shrink down and settle in his bedroom. That's when the hum of his own life's regrets became louder than the crickets outside. He lay there rigid, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old house echoing the protest in his soul. What had his life become? He was a good man, a reliable worker, a steady provider. But was that it? Was that the sum total of Wyatt? Just another part in a vast, indifferent machine, doing his duty, watching others fall away and remaining silent. He thought of Leo, of the fire in his eyes that was now just ash. He thought of his own youth, of those crude sketches in the dusty box, the forgotten dreams. They weren't just dreams of better machines, they were dreams of making things better. He'd let them die. He'd let his own belief in his influence wither, convincing himself he was just a cog. A wave of brutal honesty washed over him, chilling him to the bone despite the summer night. He wasn't just watching others give up, he had in his own way given up too. He had accepted the rigid walls, the unbending rules, the idea that his voice didn't matter, that only those with titles held power. He had chosen quiet competence over the messy, uncertain path of challenging the status quo, even when that status quo was slowly crushing the life out of good people. The burden of that realization, the heavy weight of his inaction, felt like the steel beams of the factory pressing down on his chest. It was suffocating. He'd spent so long just getting by, just doing his job, that he'd forgotten how to truly live it. Forgotten what it felt like to have a real purpose beyond the next paycheck, the next bill. He was 47, and the only thing he had truly excelled at was being invisible. The thought was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Leo, this was about Wyatt. And it was enough. The quiet enough settled in Wyatt's gut, not like a shout, but like a deep, resonant hum, a vibration that shook loose years of passive acceptance. He didn't jump up, didn't make a grand pronouncement to the empty living room. He just sat there, listening to the hum, feeling the dust motes dance in the sliver of moonlight from the window. He didn't know what enough truly meant, not yet. He just knew the old way of doing things, the quiet observation, the silent worry. The belief that his sphere of influence ended at his own two hands, that way was done. It was like a rusty gear had finally seized, and the machine had to find a new path forward, even if it creaked and groaned through the process. He wasn't going to quit the factory. It was his lifeblood, his family's security. But he couldn't just clock in and clock out as Invisible Wyatt anymore. The thought of Leo, crumpled and defeated, flashed through his mind again, and this time, it wasn't just sadness he felt. It was a spark, a tiny, stubborn flicker of indignation that demanded a response. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the quiet resolve seep into his bones. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be silence. The alarm clock, a tinny, unforgiving buzz, tore him from a shallow sleep at precisely 5 a.m. For a fraction of a second, the heavy comfort of the old routine, the almost narcotic pull of invisibility, threatened to reassert itself. He thought of turning over, pulling the worn blanket higher, letting the enough from last night dissipate like morning fog. But then he saw it, etched behind his eyelids, Leo's face, that spark gone. He pushed himself up, the familiar ache in his lower back, a grim reminder of decades spent hunched over machines. The world outside his window was still mostly dark, the streetlights casting long, weak shadows. Sarah was already up, the scent of coffee and burnt toast filling the kitchen. She looked at him, a silent question in her tired eyes. "Rough night," she murmured, placing a steaming mug in his calloused hand. He just nodded, took a long swig of the bitter coffee, and felt it burn a path down his throat, a small wake-up call for the spirit. Today wouldn't be like yesterday. He didn't know how, but it wouldn't be. The factory floor was its usual cacophony of grinding metal and hissing hydraulics. Wyatt punched his card, walked past the supervisor's office. The faint glow of the fluorescent lights glinting off the polished linoleum. Every step felt heavier than usual, each sound sharper, more urgent. He saw Leo at his station, his shoulders slumped over a half-finished assembly, the precise, practiced movements replaced by a hesitant, almost fearful touch. Wyatt's stomach tightened. His heart hammered a nervous rhythm against his ribs. What was he supposed to do? Say. He wasn't a talker. He wasn't a mentor. He was just Wyatt. He gripped the edge of his workbench, his knuckles white. The old fear, the fear of drawing attention, of messing things up, of being seen as anything other than a reliable fixture, clawed at him. But then, Leo dropped a small, intricate component. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the machine. Leo sighed, a sound heavy with despair, and slowly bent to retrieve it. That was it, that small, defeated sigh. Wyatt walked over, his steps quiet but deliberate over the din. He didn't stand over Leo, didn't cross his arms. He simply stopped a few feet away, picked up a discarded wrench, and started idly turning it in his hand, as if contemplating its very existence. "Mornin', Leo?" Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the machinery. He didn't look directly at the young man, respecting the space, the vulnerability. Leo startled, looking up quickly, his eyes still holding that defeated resignation. "Mr. Wyatt, mornin'. Trouble with that assembly?" Wyatt asked, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. He gestured vaguely at the components. "I remember when I first started on these particular units. Tricky little devils, aren't they?" Leo hesitated, then mumbled, "Yeah, keeps sticking. Can't seem to get the tolerances right. I've recalibrated the jig 3 times. He kicked lightly at the floor with his boot. "Just can't get it." Wyatt nodded slowly, still examining the wrench. "It's not always the jig, is it?" he said, more to himself than to Leo. He turned to face the young man fully then, a small knowing smile playing on his lips. "Back when I was your age, still wet behind the ears, I fought one of these for 3 days straight. Thought it was the machine, the parts, the moon phase, everything but what it actually was." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He wasn't going to give Leo the answer. That wasn't his job now. His job was to help Leo find his own. "What do you think?" Wyatt asked, his gaze soft but direct. "Is the one thing you haven't checked yet, the thing you're assuming is right, just because it should be?" Leo frowned, a faint flicker of thought replacing the dullness in his eyes. He looked at the assembly, then at the jig, then at the box of raw components. He started to open his mouth to answer, then closed it, a new thought forming. Wyatt just waited, patiently giving him the space to think, to find his own strength. He wasn't telling Leo what to do, he was simply shining a dim light on a path Leo might have forgotten how to see. This was it. This was the first step, and it was harder than any physical labor he'd ever done. Leo frowned, a faint flicker of thought replacing the dullness in his eyes. He looked at the assembly, then at the jig, then at the box of raw components. He started to open his mouth to answer, then closed it, a new thought forming. Wyatt just waited, patiently, giving him the space to think, to find his own strength. He wasn't telling Leo what to do. He was simply shining a dim light on a path Leo might have forgotten how to see. This was it. This was the first step, and it was harder than any physical labor he'd ever done. Leo didn't get the part fixed that afternoon. Not completely, but Wyatt saw him leave the factory floor with a different kind of tired in his shoulders. Not the defeated sag, but the weary slump of a man who'd been thinking, wrestling with something beyond the immediate task. That night, Wyatt slept a little lighter, but one conversation, one spark, didn't change a factory floor. The next few days were a grind. Wyatt found himself scanning the faces of the men and women he'd worked alongside for decades. He saw the same worn resignation, the same quiet acceptance of their lot. He saw young Mark struggling with a new welding sequence, his brow furrowed in frustration. He saw old Frank muttering under his breath about the new safety protocols, convinced they were just more red tape designed to slow him down. Wyatt wanted to step in, to offer a piece of advice, a shortcut he'd learned years ago. It would be so easy. A quick word, a demonstration, and the problem would be solved. But then he remembered Leo, remembered that faint flicker of thought. He remembered the lesson he was trying to learn himself. Leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about inspiring others to find their own power. So he held back. He watched Mark struggle, his hands fumbling, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Wyatt walked past, slowed his pace, caught Mark's eye. "Tough one today, huh, Mark?" he said, his voice low. Mark grunted, wiping his forehead with the back of his gloved hand. "This new pattern, it ain't right, Wyatt, keeps getting porosity." Wyatt nodded, looking at the weld, but not at Mark. He picked up a piece of scrap metal nearby, turning it over in his calloused fingers. Sometimes, he mused, it ain't the pattern that's the problem. Sometimes it's just the angle you're coming at it from. Ever tried thinking about it upside down? He didn't elaborate, he didn't point. He just offered the question, then walked on, leaving Mark staring at the metal in his hands, then at the piece Wyatt had been holding. It felt incomplete, like starting a conversation and walking away. His gut clenched, telling him he should have stayed, should have helped. But he forced himself to keep moving. He heard Frank grumbling later that day about the new safety harness, how it cinched too tight, how it restricted his movement. Wyatt listened from a distance, resisting the urge to offer a clever modification he'd seen someone else use. Instead, he just made eye contact, a small understanding nod, and kept his mouth shut. That night, the struggle really began. Sarah noticed it across the dinner table. "You're quieter than usual, Wyatt," she observed, not accusingly, just stating a fact. He just grunted, pushing food around his plate. "Just a long day." "Different long day, though, isn't it?" she pressed gently. "You look like you're carrying something new." He sighed, finally looking up. "Trying to figure something out, Sarah. Something about how things work around here, how people work." He didn't elaborate, and she, knowing him, didn't push. She just held his gaze, her eyes full of the quiet support he'd always found so comforting. By the end of the first week, Wyatt felt like he was walking through thick mud. It wasn't the physical labor that exhausted him. It was the mental effort of not doing what came naturally, of not giving the answers he knew, of not taking charge. He saw errors he could fix in seconds, frustrations he could alleviate with a word. But he forced himself to hold back, to offer only a question, a gentle nudge, a moment of patient waiting. It felt inefficient, it felt slow. He saw the same mistakes being made, sometimes repeatedly, and the old Wyatt, the reliable cog, screamed inside him to just step in and make it right. He found himself standing by his bench at break time, watching the others, feeling a loneliness he hadn't known before. He was still one of them, but now he was also something else, something undefined, something that felt like a burden. Who was he to think he could change anything, or anyone, with a few whispered questions? The rigid lines of the factory, the ingrained habits of a lifetime, felt like an unmovable mountain. He almost gave up, almost went back to just doing his job, keeping his head down, solving only his own problems. Then he saw Leo again at the end of the second week. The young man wasn't fixing the same tricky part. He was on a different station, a new challenge. But Wyatt noticed something. Leo was moving differently. He wasn't just attacking the problem head-on with brute force or frustration. He paused. He looked at the blueprint, then at the parts, then at his tools. He picked up a component, turned it over, examined it, almost like Wyatt had examined that wrench. He wasn't solving it right away, but he was thinking. He was asking questions of the problem quietly to himself. It was just a flicker, a tiny shift in posture, a subtle change in approach. No fanfare, no immediate fix, but it was there. And Wyatt, watching from across the bustling floor, felt a quiet thrum in his chest. It wasn't a win yet, not by a long shot. It was just the smallest sign that the seed he'd planted, the space he'd given, hadn't fallen on barren ground after all. And for the first time in 2 weeks, Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He wouldn't quit, not yet. The flicker in Leo grew, steady as a pilot light. Within another week, the young man wasn't just thinking through problems, he was solving them, and with a confidence that felt earned. He'd even started showing a struggling colleague how to approach a new jig, breaking it down, not telling, but asking, "What's the first thing you see here? Where does the force need to go?" Wyatt watched, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. It was like watching a sapling finally find its own sunlight. Then came Frank, a new hire, green as grass and overwhelmed by the roar of the press line. He fumbled. He hesitated, his eyes darting with panic. Wyatt caught his gaze across the floor, a silent question passing between them. Wyatt walked over, not barking orders, but leaning in close, a hand resting lightly on Frank's shoulder. "Easy, son," he murmured. "Take a breath. What's the machine telling you?" He didn't touch the controls, didn't point. He just kept asking, helping Frank translate the clatter and grind into a language he could understand, until the young man's shoulders relaxed and his hands moved with a tentative, then certain purpose. Weeks rolled into a month, then 2. Wyatt was still just Wyatt, punching the clock, running his station with the same quiet dedication. But the air on the floor had changed, subtly, like a shift in the weather you feel but can't quite name. There was less outright frustration, more low hum of problem solving. Guys would still cuss at a stubborn part, sure, but now, often enough, you'd see a quiet conversation, a head nod, then a man walking back to his station with a new idea in his eyes. "Wyatt, got a minute?" became a common refrain. It wasn't for Wyatt to fix it, though he still could. It was for his patient questions, his ability to untangle a man's frustration, to help him find the lever in his own mind. He saw the light in their eyes when they figured it out, when they solved their own damn problem. He wasn't pulling them up, he was helping them push themselves. He was still the same man, but his eyes were different. The weariness was still there, the deep lines of hard work etched around them, but beneath it a quiet fire glowed, a sense of purpose that hummed beneath his steady exterior. Sarah saw it too. Less slump in his shoulders when he came home, a lighter step, a softer, knowing smile. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky, and sometimes he'd just shake his head, a small wry chuckle escaping him. "Funny thing, Sarah," he'd say over coffee one morning. "Always thought the job was to make sure my work got done, to put in my time, keep my head down. Thought leadership was about the guys in the corner office, the ones with the loud voices telling everyone what to do." He paused, stirring his coffee. "Turns out the real work, it's helping others get their work done the right way, their way. It ain't about telling folks what to do. It's about helping them see what they're capable of and then getting out of their way. A good leader just helps others find their own strength so they can stand tall on their own. And that's the truth of it, ain't it? That some men, they don't lead by pushing or by pulling. They lead by seeing, by listening, by asking. They lead by helping folks find the light they already carry inside.